Well, good evening or good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Professor Daniele. Thank you for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
ICEUR is currently interviewing international experts on Russia and Ukraine in order to get a bigger picture of what is going on there. So, you're a professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, who is specialized in Eastern European and post-Soviet politics. It's already more than 4 weeks since Russia started the invasion of Ukraine, and at the beginning, numerous analysts were predicting that the Russian army would take over large parts of Ukraine swiftly. However, when we look now at the ground, the situation looks very different. What makes Ukrainian resistance so effective?
I think there are two things. One is the Ukrainians being so effective, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I think it's also important to recognize the extent to which the Russian army has underperformed everybody's expectations in terms of their readiness, their logistical support, the willingness of the soldiers to fight, and so on. But the Ukrainians, I think many of us, especially those of us who spent time in Ukraine, we knew the Ukrainians would fight. We didn't know how effectively they would be able to fight. And what we've seen is they very quickly have been able to adjust their tactics to what Russia is doing, and to be very creative in using relatively light weaponry to stop these massive columns of Russian tanks and armored vehicles. And that in a nutshell is what it is. I think another important factor has been supplies of weapons delivered from the West, both in the run-up to the conflict and since the conflict has started. Clearly, light anti-armor and anti-aircraft weapons have had a major impact in blunting the Russian offensive. You have a Russian army that's kind of a very typical, I would call it 20th century army, right? Columns of tanks, armor, artillery, supported by aircraft. And what you have with the Ukrainians is in part an army that's based on that, but a much weaker version, but also a more sort of loosely organized army in which, in addition to this regular army, you've got independent groups of citizens, 10, 20 people using drones, using electronic surveillance and so on to identify where Russian soldiers are, where formations are, and to use all kinds of means of getting at them. And so it's this inherently adaptable, flexible model that Ukrainians are taking advantage of, that a very rigidly organized army like the Russian one, I think, is having a lot of difficulty dealing with. But again, I also think we need to think really hard about, or we need to look hard at how the Russian army has underperformed and what that tells us about the Russian system. Putin's basis of power is allowing people to do corrupt things in return for support for him. Well, the military has not been exempt for this, and so you find equipment that's not been maintained because the money's being stolen, equipment that in some cases may not have ever been produced to specifications, shortages of all kinds of ammunition, and so on. And then on top of that, an army that I think was psychologically unprepared for war, largely because Putin swore that he wasn't actually going to invade Ukraine. And from everything we know, the soldiers were sent on maneuvers in Belarus or in parts of Russia, and they were told that they were just going on maneuvers. And so they found themselves completely unexpectedly, and I think were shocked to find themselves in combat, number one, and then number two, in combat against a very determined and very skilled opponent. And so having been surprised by what they encountered, I think there's been just this simple, I don't want to call it a refusal, but just a sort of a collapse of the Russians' military sense of what was going to work and what wasn't. And so now what we see 5 weeks in is the Russian army regrouping, right? This announcing of pulling back around Kiev, as far as we can tell, that's not really a pullback. That's a regrouping and a resupplying. And so having sort of had their noses bloodied in the first few weeks of this conflict, there's some signs that Russia is maybe reconsidering what it can achieve, but I think there's other signs that say Russia is sort of reloading and rearming and going to come back again much much tougher. But everything that we can tell is that when they come back much tougher, they're going to endure a lot more casualties, because whatever it is that they do, the Ukrainians seem to be more determined to fight than the Russians, which isn't surprising. The Ukrainians are fighting for their own land. The Russians are fighting over somebody else's. And the Ukrainians, it's their territory. They know their way around much better. And then lastly, they have this much more flexible way of fighting that will allow them to adapt very quickly to whatever Russia is doing.
Thank you for your analysis.
Yeah.
So recently there have been a number of Russian statements that gas and oil export are to be paid in ruble exclusively,
Yeah.
which Western politicians seem to be slightly confused about it, and there have been different statements. But which are the reasons behind this move, and how likely is it that Russia will stop supplying gas to the European Union and other countries?
The move to get Western companies to pay in rubles is driven by a very simple logic, which is that one consequence of Western sanctions is that the ruble has collapsed in value. And especially for Russia buying imports that it needs from around the world, those imports now become dramatically more expensive if you're paying with rubles that are now worth less, because things have to be paid for in hard currencies, like the dollar or the euro or the pound. The goal of saying we want you to pay for energy in rubles is that would force all those billions of dollars or billions of euros to be converted into rubles. So that would force the Western energy firms to buy rubles with their euros and dollars. And that increased demand for the ruble would start pushing the value of the ruble back up. So it's really an effort to stem the collapse of the ruble. I think it's unlikely to work because all of the contracts are quite clearly written that they are to be paid in dollars or euros, or in a few cases, British pounds. And so the Western Europe has taken the position that this is what the contract says, and we're going to continue to abide by the contract. Now, there is this bit of strangeness that on the one hand, there's this war going on, and the West has put all of these sanctions on Russia, while at the same time, both Russia and the West have said, but we want to preserve this one part of the relationship intact. And that is the sale of oil and gas to Western Europe, because both Russia and Western Europe are highly dependent on it. And so while this war is going on, there's still this one area where everybody's saying, no, we're going to play by all the legal rules, right? What Russia is now sort of at least implying, and in some cases saying, is they may simply stop honoring those contracts, stop supplying oil and gas to Western Europe. This has been a fear of the West for some time. It's one of the reasons why there were a lot of people who argued that the Nord Stream pipeline should not be completed. Frankly, it's an argument that goes all the way back to the 1980s when these pipelines were first built. If Russia were to cut off the supply of gas in particular to Western Europe, it would become in the medium term a very big problem for Western Europe in different countries. But the statistic that keeps getting thrown around is that Germany gets 40% of its natural gas from Russia. At the same time, however, Russia is hugely dependent on the flow of money that goes back in the other direction. And a significant part of Russia's GDP, and in particular of the Russian government budget, is provided for by those payments for energy. And so both sides have a pretty big interest in not severing that relationship. And so we'll have to see what happens. Russia has about $600 billion in reserves stored up that it could rely on in the short term if the money stopped coming from Western Europe. But a lot of those reserves are in foreign banks, and their access has been cut off. So it's a kind of a very tricky game for one side or the other to really weaponize that energy relationship.
Thank you. So let's have a look at the bigger picture and the context of the current conflict. In 2019, you published a book called Ukraine and Russia: From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War. So where does the dynamic come from which led Putin to invade Ukraine?
This is the question everybody's asking. The thing I stress in my book is that this goes back to the very collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And at that time, if anyone was paying attention, or if you go back and read what Russian leaders were saying at the time, even the most pro-Western leaders, people like Boris Yeltsin, were saying the collapse of the Soviet Union is fine. We definitely want to get rid of communism, but Ukraine and Russia and Belarus have to remain united. And while there was debate about exactly what that has to mean, can Ukraine be in some ways independent, there was still a sense that in important respects, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus had to remain in some way joined together. And the Ukrainians have really resisted that from the very beginning and consistently since then. And so there has been this disagreement from the word go about the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Over time, there also grew to be a disagreement between Russia and what we might broadly call the West about Russia's role in Europe. And what happened over time, and I specifically argue around 2004 at the time of Ukraine's Orange Revolution, in Russian eyes, these two things came to be seen as a single issue. And maybe to some extent in the eyes of the West as well, which is Russia's conflict with the West and Russia's efforts to subvert Ukraine increasingly looked like a single conflict. And so Ukraine became the place, not only a place that Russia desperately wanted to control, but a sort of a place where a conflict between Russia and the West about what the future of Europe was going to look like was being waged. To use a very rough analogy for people who are older than you, Ukraine has kind of come to play the role in the post-Cold War situation that Berlin played during the Cold War. The territory that was being contested, and in some respects, the symbol of the conflict. So that does not give you a direct answer to your question, except to say that over time, Russia had a series of a desire to recontrol Ukraine and a series of grievances towards the West, which in Russia's eyes were embodied in the West policy towards Ukraine. And what it appears, and I think we need to understand this better than we do now, is that by 2022, Putin said, I don't feel like I'm getting what I want by negotiating and by using economic coercion and by using the small war strategy that I used in 2014, seizing Crimea and a chunk of territory in eastern Ukraine. And he's just decided that he's going to go for it and accept the costs that go with that. So I don't think, speaking for myself, I don't fully understand what changed so dramatically in the last few months and years that made Putin, who was somebody who previously we thought was ruthless but very careful and very sensitive to risks, what has now made him do something that seems like he's not very sensitive to risks or costs at all. That shift we don't really understand very well. But I think that's at the heart of what's happening.
Well, so Ukrainian civilians is suffering enormously under the current conflict, and millions of them have already entered the European Union as refugees.
Yeah.
But in the past, refugees have been a difficult topic for the European Union. And what do you think? Will this question divide the community on the medium term?
You know, it's been interesting to see how the response to Ukrainian refugees has been different compared to, for example, the response to Syrian refugees after 2015. And I'm not the first person to notice this, of course. Especially in Poland, the Ukrainians have been much more welcome, but also in Germany and in other places as well. And I think it's in part because of the cultural connections. There's obviously a long historical and cultural relationship between Poland in particular and Ukraine. But I think it's also due to just the proximity of the conflict and the horror in Western Europe at what Russia's doing. So far, there's been much more unity in Europe and much more willingness to accept refugees. I think as the numbers grow, and the numbers are now in the millions, and as the crisis endures, we'll have to see whether that tolerant policy and that unity endures. I know in several countries, the United Kingdom is a good example. Actually, in my own country, the United States is a good example. The leaders have said very positive things about accepting refugees, but the concrete actions haven't been very substantial yet. And so you can imagine that becoming a controversy going forward, that some other countries are going to say, we've taken our share, it's time for some others to take some too.
Thank you. So this conflict has, of course, a lot of geopolitical implications, and it is already changing the security architecture in Europe. But how could it look like in the future, and which role will be played by the EU and NATO?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. It's the big question, right? Which is, at some point down the road, we collectively, the US, the Western Europeans, the Russians, right, have to figure out how to live together, right? Or how to kill each other. So we have to figure out how to live together. And the problem that I really see, the reason why this war is so important is that Russia has destroyed so much of what peace in Europe has been built on, not only since 1991, but since 1945. In particular, even at the height of the Cold War, even over the various crises in Berlin, nobody during the Cold War really tried to change borders by using force, because there was a recognition that we didn't want to try to refight World War II or World War I, and we surely did not want to fight World War III. Russia has now, in a way, thrown that out. So the question is, how do you rebuild an architecture with a power that behaves the way that Russia has behaved? We can sign a whole bunch of new agreements, but there were already multiple agreements in place through which Russia had promised to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and its borders. And in fact, one of those treaties, right, Ukraine had agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in return for Russia declaring that it accepted Ukraine's sovereignty and its borders. And it was not, historically, not that much later, basically 20 years later, that Russia completely violated that. And so it's hard to know how you build an agreed architecture on that. And so I think what we're likely to see in the short term is not a new architecture in a jointly agreed to sense, but rather a new, a renewal of the NATO alliance that's based on an understanding that at some point, the only way to provide for security in Europe is to be able to defend that security against Russian aggression. Now, hopefully, as part of resolving this conflict, we can get to a point where maybe Russia can get to the point where it's satisfied with the state of affairs in Europe. But until that gets to be the case, Russia will always have an incentive to overthrow everything. And at the root of this conflict is the fact that Russia decided it wasn't willing to tolerate the way things were currently going in Europe. The problem with saying Russia needs to be satisfied is that depending on which version of Putin you listen to, Russia being satisfied might include a lot of things that are completely unacceptable to its neighbors and to the West. And so as of yet, a new architecture that would really work and be sustainable does not appear to be possible. And if I apologize for sounding pessimistic, but that's how I see things right now.
Well, thank you for your assessment. Is there any additional point you would like to make in the context of the current war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I'd say two things that at least sort of that I've been thinking about that I don't think have been given enough attention. One is that amidst the talk of possible Russian troop realignments and negotiations in Turkey, there's a sense about, and of course, Russia now recognizing that the Ukrainians are not just going to cave in. There's a sense that maybe we're close to a settlement of the conflict. I've been saying since the beginning of this conflict that anybody who tries to, war is a notoriously hard thing to predict. And of course, the fact that you pointed out all the predictions were wrong is evidence of that. So I don't want to predict how this war is going to go. But I will say we should not be too confident that it's coming to a close end. And I think for Western Europe, for Ukraine, for everybody involved, there needs to be thinking about policies for this war becoming a marathon rather than a sprint. As we are now, we've been 5 weeks in now I think about World War I, which everybody thought was going to be over by Christmas and ended on, not really stopping for another 4 years until Europe was all destroyed. These things have a way of dragging on. And so we need to think about that. The other thing that I think we're going to see down the road over maybe 6 or 8 months from now is real food insecurity in Ukraine, potential starvation. Ukraine is a huge agricultural provider, has largely been self-sustaining in food, but what should be happening right now in Ukraine is the spring crop should be getting planted, and partly because the Russians are deliberately targeting fuel supplies, and partly just because people have fled their residences. There's not a lot of food being planted, and so the conditions are already in place several months from now for a famine, and the world needs to think about how to deal with that. And I should say not only in Ukraine, but in places very far from Ukraine, where if people are living on the margin economically and the price of wheat all of a sudden doubles, right? People are in places very far from Ukraine will go from being able to feed themselves to not being able to feed themselves, right? And this is something I think the world has not really thought through very much yet, how we're going to meet those needs. So again, sorry for not being more cheerful. I am afraid that there's a lot worse to come, and that for the West in particular, but as well as for Ukraine, the commitment that the West has made so far to Ukraine is going to have to be a commitment of months and years, not of weeks. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for your analysis and providing your point of view and sharing it with us.
Thank you.